The name of the sermon is called A Call to Arms. This is what Jesus is talking and telling his disciples to do. It's a call to arms. He's showing them what kind excuse me, of thing is expected and calling them to follow his example. I want to look at the kind of things that were expected from this story in the Lord's Supper, and especially when Jesus washed his disciples' feet. Now, there was a bunch of important things happened in this ahead of time. And they're interesting things, and I think we should look at them. Now, the reason that they're interesting is if these things had happened as they should, Jesus would have never had to wash the disciples' feet. Excuse me. Every once in a while you get something in your throat, and it's not flies because it's not the season for it. It's just something else. And so Jesus sent Peter and John to prepare the Passover. And you'd say, well, that's nice, that's great. But there were some things that happened that you have to look at. Now, one of the things is, the first thing is that if Jesus had planned this ahead of time and let everyone know, Judas was looking to betray him. He'd already gone to the chief priests and he got the money and he was just looking for an opportunity. And if Jesus had said ahead of time, we're going to go to such and such a place tomorrow for the Passover, and that's Judas Iscariot could very well have went to the chief priests and said, we're meeting at such and such a house and you send the soldiers there. Because it would be perfect. There would be nobody in the streets. They would be in his house. They could be surrounded. And people of that culture wouldn't think, this is the Passover, nothing is going to interfere with that. People wouldn't do that. And Judas could have been with them. And he could have been as feigned surprised as everyone else. Oh, I didn't know this was happening. He could have got away with it. No one would have been the wiser. But Jesus wasn't going to have that. He sent Peter and John off to do this, and he didn't tell them where it was going to happen. He just said, follow a man carrying some water and stop at the house and ask the man, say to the man, this is where the Lord wants to have his Passover. Can you provide a room? Now, this is kind of funny. What does all that preparing, Jesus said they wanted to prepare this room. And what does that entail? What are these preparations? And if anyone has prepared a supper, they know that you can do it really well or you can just do it to get by. There's a Seinfeld. If you remember in the 90s, there was a show on TV called Seinfeld. Anyway, in one of these shows, and I'm not, it's so long ago I can't remember for sure if it was Seinfeld or something else, but somebody had this question. They wanted to have a party at their house. But they couldn't afford all the food. And so the guy said, look, it doesn't cost hardly anything to have a big party. And see, here's what you do. You get 2 loaves of bread, a small package of sliced meat, and a small jar of mayonnaise. And you put mayonnaise on on the bread, you cut it diagonally, you squish it in your hands some, you put a few pieces of sliced meat on the trays, and you take a bite out of some of the sandwiches. And then when the people come in, they'll look at it and say, I guess I'm too late. People were hungry right at the start of the party and it's all gone. It's all on the trays, and you say, so it only costs $10, and who's going to know? Right? That's why they have these sayings that the hostess with the mostest. That's why if you are in the industry, in a hotel industry, you can get a 1-star or a 5-star. There's a big difference. The 5-star are the people that really do the preparation, really look after people the way they're supposed to. Now, I wonder if Peter and John would have got 5 stars or 1 star. I wonder if they'd had the little cards on the table at the Last Supper that says, fill these cards out and send us, do the online survey. Would they have gotten 3s or 2s or 1s? Now, the reason I'm saying this is Jesus had a problem, and he was surrounded by people, by men with dirty feet. Now, I want to look at Luke 22. This is the story in Luke, the same story in Luke about Jesus sending his disciples. Luke 22:7. Then came the first day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. And Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, go and prepare the Passover for us, so that we may eat it. And he said to him, where do you want us to prepare it? And he said to them, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house that he enters. And you shall say to the owner of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large furnished upper room. Prepare it there. And they left and found everything just as he told them, and they prepared the Passover. Now, he'd given Peter and John the job to prepare for the Passover, and they found the house and everything was exactly as he said. Now, in that culture, there were things that were expected of people. In ancient cultures, there was, if someone came to your house, you were expected to provide food and lodging and water for them to wash their feet. If you remember, Abraham was visited by 3 people. One of them was God, and he washed their feet. It was expected after a trip. Now, as I see it, Jesus chose this man specifically for reasons that would include he would be willing to give them the room as opposed to sending them away. And my question I have in my head is, did he choose someone who would say, I will provide you with everything you need. If you need servants, I will provide. Or did he choose to provide, and choose a man who would only say, you got the room, you're on your own. And then Jesus would have this opportunity to do this lesson for them. Now, if he chose someone who would give everything, did the disciples say, no, we don't need that? Or did, if they hadn't done it, why didn't the disciples say, look, we need to prepare to wash people's feet, so if there's bowls and towels, we'd like to have them. We would need them for the supper. Well, obviously, it didn't happen. They weren't prepared, because if it did happen, if they had provided the bowls and got the disciples to wash the feet, Jesus wouldn't have had to do this. And also, if you continue on in verse 5, it says that Jesus poured water into a basin, and he took a towel and tied it around his waist, so both were available. So the question is, why didn't Peter and John do this simple thing? At least provide the water and the towels and direct people to do it. Well, you see, they were there ahead of time. They prepared everything else. And did they not even discuss this thing of foot washing? Did the owner of the house do it for them? And I think they probably learned that this at home. It was it was known, especially John. If you remember the rest of the story of Jesus is betrayed and he's taken to the chief priest's house, and John walked right into his house because he was a family friend. They allowed him right in. He had to go and let Peter in. The point is, if they were family friends of the chief priest, his family had to be the type of family that was very careful to do these cleaning things, these things that because the chief priest, this is what they did every day. This is what their life was all about, doing proper traditions and following them. Now the question, of course, comes to did they fail to even think about getting somebody to do it? And if not, why didn't they at very least offer the opportunity for people to wash their feet? In Luke 7:44, if you remember that story, Jesus is going to Simon's house. Simon has invited him to his house, and the woman comes in, not the woman I read in this. It's another woman, it's another story. But the woman came in, she cried, she washed Jesus' feet with her tears, and she wiped them with her hair. In verse 44 it says, turning toward the woman, she said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. So my assumption is that the disciples were with him because he took them everywhere with him. He was training them. And all of this information that was, somebody had to be there to see it, to hear it, so that they could relay it to Luke to write it down. So my answer is yes, I think that the disciples knew that this was important to Jesus, this tradition of washing people's feet. Well, let's look at the text. 13:1-5. Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. When I was reading this, I noticed in verse 3 how it said all things were given into his hand. And I thought, all things, what does all things mean? Well, all things means everything. It means the stars and the planets and the galaxies and the black holes and all of time and all the animals that ever existed and all the humans that were born from Adam to the end of time. All things were given into his hand. In spite of all that, all things were his. He was willing to wash somebody's feet. He was willing to, the most humble job. There's a science fiction movie from 2016 called Jupiter Ascending. And in the start of the movie, there's this girl whose mother had died and she'd been kind of enveloped by the rest of the family. And the rest of the family had this little business. It wasn't a fancy business, it was just kind of a word-of-mouth thing that they would clean people's apartments. And so, as the start of the movie, it's just like drudgery. Here they are, they've got their buckets and they're cleaning it, and they go to people's apartments, and they're beautiful apartments, and her assignment, her name was Jupiter, her assignment was to wash the bathrooms. And here she is cleaning toilets. And she's not a happy girl cleaning toilets because her mother has always said she's going to be important. And she doesn't see it. And as the movie goes on, you discover, this science fiction obviously, and you have to go with it, but she discovers that her DNA is an exact match for the richest woman in the universe who has died, and now she's the heir. She owns planets and galaxies all over the universe, and including Earth. And so she goes and claims her right. She's the queen. She now owns vast quantities of the universe. And I love the final scene. She's come back to Earth. No one's the wiser. She's with her family. You can hear them bickering good-naturedly in the rest of the room, and she's at the toilet cleaning the toilet. And you look on her face and she's smiling. She's exactly where she wants to be. She's doing the humble task because she loves these people she's with. Well, this was Jesus. God the Father had given everything into his hands, and he was using these hands to wash the disciples' feet. He's going to take the lowest servant's job. Now, here's a little interesting information. You always pick the lowest servant to do the job because it was so demeaning. And if you were a servant or a slave of the Israelite tribe, if you were an Israelite, you could refuse that job. Nope, that's below me. The only person you could force to do that would be a foreign slave. So that's how far down the pecking order you would have to be required to clean someone's feet. Well, he was going to tackle this job. And it was something that should have been done. Peter and John should have made arrangements, maybe somebody to do it, or at the very least, they should have been provided the water and provided the towels and directed people to do it. But it was left, and it was left to Jesus to use it for a last lesson, and he was willing to do it. Well, number two is always the hard one. You know who the hard one is, right? It's Peter. Always the hard one. It says in verse 6, and he came to Simon Peter and said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I do, you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. And Peter said to him, never shall you wash my feet. He's the hard one to get along with. And Jesus answered and said, if I do not wash you, you will have no part with me. And Simon Peter said to him, Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. And Jesus said to him, he who is bathed need only to wash his feet, but he is completely clean. But you are all clean, but not all of you. For he knew the one who would betray him. For this reason he said, not all of you are clean. Now the rest of the disciples would be in shock. Like, this doesn't happen. The master, the teacher, doesn't wash people's feet. But Peter had to say something because he always said something. He saw the injustice of it, and he recognized it as a job that he should have arranged to have done. And he was going to let it pass. Now, there's something that you need to do, and I don't know if I'm the only one that this has ever happened to. I suspect I'm not. But you need to behave in such a way that the situation doesn't come to the point that someone more humble than you takes on that job that you knew was yours. I remember times where I should have done something or I should have said something and somebody else stepped up and did it, and I realized that that was my task, And if I wasn't so proud, I would have done it, and then I wouldn't be ashamed of myself for not doing it. Now, there's another thing that happened here that, if you think about it, Jesus did things and the disciples got to do them too. If you remember, Jesus walked on water, and Peter said, "If it is you, let me get out of the boat and walk on water too." So Peter had the opportunity to say to Jesus, "You've washed my feet, can I wash the rest of the disciples' feet? Because this is a whole learning process, and I want to be part of it." Well, sometimes if it's staring you in the face and you don't do it, and if and here's what I found is your conscience is working on, and there's a little war going on in your conscience. That they have a picture of the little devil and the little angel, and you're doing it too slow, and the war is going too slow, and the whole opportunity has passed you by because you had an opportunity to do it, but you argued with yourself too long and the moment passed. And Jesus said, "You will understand, you don't understand now, you'll understand later." But Peter would have enough understanding then to know he messed up. And there was a chance now that he could correct it. You might be thinking, well, maybe Peter was the last guy to get his feet washed. And it is possible that he came to Peter last, and so Peter didn't have this opportunity. But I think Jesus, and I know Jesus knew that what was going to happen. He knew that he was going to be betrayed. He knew that Peter was going to say these things, and I think he would have given him the opportunity to do this. Look, you can wash the rest of the disciples' feet if that's what you want to do. Well, anyway, he had a chance, an opportunity to be part of this ministry. Jesus was a teacher after all, and this would be a perfect opportunity for them to learn in the moment. They got the chance to heal. He sent them out to heal. They'd driven out demons, and they got to learn that. They'd also, on the week before, had an opportunity to put their coats down, so on Palm Sunday, Jesus could ride over them on the donkey. They had lots of opportunities to do things. And this was the perfect opportunity to learn. And if you say, well, I think Peter was probably the last, there was 12 other disciples that could have said, oh, I see what you're doing, can I do the rest? Judas Iscariot could have offered. Any one of them could have offered to do this. It was a perfect chance to serve among friends. You know how that thing, if you're going to try something new, try it in front of your family and your friends. It's not, if you fail, they love you, as opposed to doing it in front of some people that don't. They had a perfect opportunity. Did no one think I should take over this menial task so the master won't have to do it? You know, that they did that whole thing. They were going through Samaria earlier. And they came to a village and they wanted to stop and get food, and they wouldn't have anything to do with them. And the disciples said, do you want me to call down fire from heaven and destroy the village so that you won't have to? And Jesus said no. You see, they were willing to do some things for Jesus. And I wonder to myself, if they couldn't, why couldn't they step in and say, I'll do this. This is a great lesson. May I finish? But maybe the yuck factor was too much. Number 3 is the wake-up call, 12 to 17. So when he had washed their feet and taken up his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If then I, the Lord and teacher, wash your feet, you should also wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you also should do as I did to you. Truly I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor the one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. In verse 14 and 15, he made it clear that they should wash each other's feet. In verse 16, he said that the slave is not greater than the master. And so what he was saying is, I'm a master and I'm sending you. It's acceptable and desirable for me to do the things, then it is also for you to do them. Now, you know what it says, go into all the world and preach the gospel? Well, when you go into all the world and preach the gospel, sometimes it includes washing feet or jobs like that. Now, in the early church, they learned this lesson. And in the early church, slaves were the lowest of any person. But rich people, a slave would come into the church and the rich people would stand up and step back and give them and offer them, require them to take their seat. They were doing what Jesus had done. They were trying to be that people. Now, you see, what it was supposed to do, is supposed to be throw the world into chaos, and it did, but in a good way. And when we do things like this, it also does the same thing. Now, foot washing was a necessity back then. Because here, I'm trying to put it in the most delicate way, is that sometimes the road was muddy, and it was because a donkey or an oxen had drank some water and they left some used water on the road. And when the road was muddy, it wasn't all mud. Some of it was other things. I looked this up. In New York City, in 1890, 1895, that area, there were 100,000 horses in the city, and 2.5 million pounds of manure were left on the streets every day. Somebody had to clean that up. Oh, and when it rained, it ran everywhere, and when it was dry, it would be squished and squished and squished and dried, and the wind would blow it away, and you'd breathe it in. And if you had the windows open, it would be on your food and in every part of your house. It was such a problem that the big cities sent delegates to a meeting to say, we have to come up with a fix for this horrible problem. It's a real problem. And they met. This 3-day meeting was planned, and they met for 4 hours, and they gave up. They said, we can't fix it. It's an impossible thing to fix. You know what fixed it, of course? Cars. But anyway, we don't have that problem anymore because we have cars that put out a different kind of pollution. But the point is, most people, when they put, like these are clean socks this morning, if you washed my feet, it wouldn't be such a horrible job. And so we don't do it anymore. It is not expected. Well, I'm going to tell you a story of a certain man that took Jesus' words to heart. There was a Salvation Army man who recognized a problem in the city he lived in, and the Salvation Army man knew that older homeless people needed foot care. Because when you sleep on the streets, when you live rough, old comes faster. And you can't do things like get at your feet, even if you wanted to cut your toe. See, most people can't do this. But the point is, he would do that. And he recognized that these men maybe hadn't changed their socks in a month. And so what he did was he chose a place like a bathroom, a public area, and he would bring a basin and he'd have them sit on the toilet, and he would kneel in front of them, and he'd wash their feet, and then he'd clean their toenails, and they would have ingrown toenails because they hadn't done proper foot care. And you know what an ingrown toenail feels like when you have to kind of get it out. And sometimes he would get a kick from the other foot, and he'd end up sprawled across the bathroom floor. And now he had to get up without anger and return and kneel again and apologize for the pain he had caused and ask them if he could continue and make it seem like they were allowing him, it was a great privilege for him to do it, when really it was a kindness that was most people would not want to tackle. I know I used to cut my father's feet, toenails, and he banged one of them, and it was like a quarter of an inch thick, and when you cut it, it was like, I had toenails in my hair. I'm saying it's not the nicest job, but this man was willing to do it, and I thought it was a wonderful thing.
You know that they're going around now taking socks? Do you know that? That's just happened the last couple of weeks in the newspaper that I saw, okay? The Salvation Army are collecting socks.
Yes.
So that they can go out there and take each one of them and put a dry pair of socks on in the afternoon because they're already wet and cold and whatever.
A guy from Hillside, friend, donated 20 socks. He gathered 5,000 pairs of socks because if you have wet feet, that's what the Army said. The Army travels on its feet. And if you didn't have clean socks, you've got problems.
And they have great socks and they cost $14 a pair because I looked. The Army socks.
Yes. But still they would get foot problems if they didn't change this, keep rotating them. Well, 2 weeks ago we talked about prayer and talking to God, and last week we talked about listening to God and doing something new because He told you to. And this week we're talking about a call to arms. And we're going to do what He calls us to do. Now, if we listen, God's going to speak to us. Jim Beverly had this story, and I thought it was, what a great story. His son was in Toronto, and he was visiting Toronto, and he drove his bike to a store, went into the store, got something, came out, and his bike was stolen. And now, it was a nice bike, he was angry, he went home, he was sitting on the couch, he was praying, he was mad, and God said, go get your bike. Now, he could very well have ignored God, because that's a crazy thing to say, go get your bike, but where is it? Toronto's a big place, where am I going to go? Who am I going to see? What's the chances? So he got in his car and he went to get his bike. And he came to a light that just turned red, was turning red. Some squeegee kid went out and cleaned his windshield and held out his hand. And he was mad and he said, I'm not. But then he said, this kid's probably having a worse day than I'm having. So he put his window down and he gave him a toonie, or a loony. And the kid said, I hear you lost your bike. What kid? What chance? Red light, no red light, he wouldn't. Oh, man, I heard you lost your bike. Yes, I lost my bike. Do you know where it is? Yes, I do. Can you show me? Yes, I can. Get in the car. Drove him to someplace. He ran away. He came back with the bike. He listened to God. It's a great story, I thought. Anyway, but when you listen to God and you're going to do something, it's got to be sincere. Nancy Pelosi, you know who Nancy Pelosi is. She's the head of the the House Whip or whatever it's called. And she says, she said this often, I pray for Donald Trump every day. I pray for him and his family and his health and his safety, and I pray for him. And she tells him that all the time. And he doesn't really believe her. And lots of other people are saying, I don't know. You see, it has to be sincere. I can't judge her heart, but her actions don't say. When he had the State of the Nation address, she tore up his speech. I don't know if this is somebody you praise for. Well, Jesus was calling for actions that are hard to call into question. When we do some humble act, like in this case, foot washing, and people say, yeah, I know, but it's a nice gesture, but, and then there's a long pause, because they can't think of anything to say at the end. It's a nice gesture. Like I said with Nancy Pelosi, it's nice that she's praying, but is she using those little dolls and the pins? If you do something nice, like the Salvation Army man, yeah, it's a nice gesture, but there's nothing you can say at the end. It's a nice gesture. It's a wonderful, kind act that's sincere in every way. Now, God calls us to silence our critics with actions that are pure. If you remember Nathaniel, Jesus was picking up disciples, and in John 1:47, Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, and he said, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit or guile." What he was saying is, this guy is if he does something, it's pure. This is what our actions should say to people. He or she is doing this with no ulterior motive other than kindness and an opportunity to obey Jesus. Kevin Vinson said this he said something. Kevin Vinson was the Apahawk Church for years and years, and he had this saying that he'd said it so often that people could finish it. You know how God is good all the time God is good. People can finish a saying like that. Well, he said, if you say you are, you have to be. If you say you are, you have to be. He came up with this because he heard a Catholic priest saying on the radio, you don't have to agree with everything the Catholic Church does, but if you're going to be a Catholic, you should obey and adhere to the attendant, what the church does. He said, if Prime Minister Paul Martin came to me, I would put him out of the church because of his views on abortion and other things. And Kevin said he went home and he couldn't sleep, and he tossed and turned all night, and he came up with these 9 words at the end in the morning. If you say you are, you have to be. So if you say you're an athlete, you have to do athletic things. If you say you're a hockey player, you got to put on the skates and the uniform, and you got to skate with other men who are doing that. You can't say you're a boxer unless you put things in boxes. I should try to sneak that one by you. The point is, if you call yourself a Christian, you have to do the things that God says you are going to need to do. You have to do these things, or don't call yourself a Christian. If you say you are, you have to be. Alexander the Great was a very brave soldier. He actually, in spite of the fact that he was the king of Greece, and he would take his army, but he always led them. No one ever questioned if he was scared, because he was leading them into battle. and he could not abide cowardice. And if at the end of the battle he would judge his soldiers who had failed, and he was judging this one particular 17-year-old blonde, nice-looking boy who had done something wrong. And he actually had pity on him because he liked the look of him. And he said, "What's your name?" And and everyone recognized that if he hadn't just sentenced him to death, he was going to offer him some grace. "What's your name?" And he says, "Alexander." "What's your name?" "Alexander." And he was out of the chair, and he had his hands around the guy's neck, and he had him down on the ground, and he said, "Change your name or change your actions. You cannot be Alexander and be a coward." Well, Jesus doesn't have his hands around our neck, and he's not going to behave that way, but he's going to still, he's calling us gently to do what we're supposed to, follow his directions, follow his lead, or change our name. We can't be both. If you say you are, you have to be.